Hey guys, this is Danny Boy. So in an effort to create a Demon Hunter build, I am now level 60 on a Demon Hunter, I have been doing a bunch of math and trying to work out the actual damage of all of the Demon Hunter's various abilities and how they perform in real situations. I apologize for the lack of videos for these past few days, but I've had to restart this a bunch of times because I'll work out the math for something, and then I'll try it out in actual practice and discover, oh wait, this doesn't actually work that way. Unfortunately, Blizzard gives you very little information in-game, and I'm not really big on all the data mining and all that stuff. But anyway, as I said, I'm going to compare the various abilities for the Demon Hunter. I'm going to break it up into several episodes, though, and first just start out with the Hatred Builders, the 4 primaries, along with Evasive Fire and Devices. And I'm going to first compare their single target, theoretical damage, and then compare their AoE potential. So to start, we're going to look at Hungering Arrow. It costs 3 Hatred, does 115% weapon damage, and has a 35% chance to pierce through targets. Just so you know, this is how you calculate how much damage an ability is actually going to do. First, you figure out whatever your base damage is. So in order to figure out your base damage, you go over to your abilities, you look at your weapon. So my weapon does 467 to 646 damage, and also does 168 to 284 holy damage. That holy damage is not actually calculated in its DPS. They don't include that for some reason. Kind of weird, but they don't include that. So if you have 2 weapons with identical DPS, but one weapon has elemental damage on it and the other weapon doesn't, and you put in the weapon that has elemental damage into your slot, you'll notice that you have a damage increase. That's why that is. But so you first figure out what your actual damage is. I'm going to, just for the sake of brevity, take my DPS. So it does 612 DPS. Then I go into my details and I look at how much my damage is increased by my primary stat. For Demon Hunters, that's Dexterity, so it's 700%. So I multiply 612 times 700 divided by 100, and I get 4,284. Now, further, I would multiply it by attacks per second to give me a better idea of what my damage is, but I just want my base damage, so we're going to just leave it at an average of 4,284. We're not going to figure in attacks per second, and we're not going to figure in critical chance and critical damage. So, 4,284. Now I want to figure out how much damage my Hungering Arrow is going to do. Well, I simply multiply 4,284 by 115, and then divide that by 100, and I get 4,926.6. That's about how much damage on average a Hungering Arrow is going to do per shot without critting. You don't then add the 4,284 damage to the 4,926.6. It's just 4,926.6. It doesn't like double dip or anything like that. So that's how you figure out what your actual damage is going to be. Puncturing Arrow gives it a greater chance to pierce, which will give it a theoretical DPS increase, a theoretical damage increase because it's piercing more often. It's hitting the same target more often or multiple targets. But we're not going to talk so much about Puncturing Arrow because I think that there are definitely better choices, and the math is kind of difficult to predict and to figure out for Puncturing Arrow. Cinder Arrow is giving it a straight 35% additional damage as fire over 3 seconds, so you're adding 35% to your 115% and getting 150%, which is definitely an increase, but against single targets, Shatter Shot will ultimately be a better increase than Cinder Arrow or Puncturing Arrow. Shatter Shot gives you 3 more arrows, so whenever you pierce, you gain another 3 arrows. 3 times 115 is 345, plus your initial arrow of 115, doing a grand total of 460%, either to an individual target or to multiple targets. Unfortunately, the 3 arrows that you get after an arrow pierces on Shatter Shot, after it splits, cannot then pierce. You can't have, and thus split. You can't have this infinite chain reaction of arrows piercing into other arrows and splitting and splitting and splitting, causing an insane amount of damage. It's just 3 arrows per 1 arrow. Though the additional arrows that split off, a lot of times just 2 will hit, depending on how fast the target is and how large they are, not always 3. That's 460%. Before we do Devouring Arrow, let's talk about Spray of Teeth. Spray of Teeth really isn't increasing your damage against an individual target dramatically. At best, you're just adding 50% to your initial target, doing 165% weapon damage. It's more of an AoE, and unfortunately it's actually pretty poor. 50% weapon damage to enemies in an area. I'll talk about this more later, but it's a small area, so I would say it's really outshone by Shatter Shot for AoE or for single target. Next up is Devouring Arrow. So this is how Devouring Arrow works. You fire a Hungering Arrow and you do 115% weapon damage on your target. It pierces once, so you gain 70% damage. 70% of 115 is 80.5. You add that to 115 and get 195.5 damage. So after the first pierce, your arrow will now do 195.5 damage. It can hit the same target twice, or it could hit a secondary target. Let's say it pierces again. Well, 70% of 195.5 is 136.85. So you put that together, and after the second pierce, you are doing 332.35 damage. If it pierces again, which is not likely, you would gain 232.645 damage. That is 70% of 332.35. Then, add that together, and you get 564.995 after the third pierce. If you combine the initial arrow for 115% weapon damage, then after the first pierce, 195.5% weapon damage, then after a second pierce, 332.35% weapon damage, and finally, after a third pierce, 564.995% weapon damage, you have a grand total of 1,207.845% weapon damage. So as you can see, damage on Devouring Arrow can add up very, very quickly and can become quite potent. Generally speaking, you'll just pierce once, sometimes two, rarely three, but it absolutely can happen because you're spamming the attack. And you're going from 115% weapon damage after 3 pierces to over 1,200% weapon damage. Spread over 4 arrows, mind you. So that is Hungering Arrow's potential. Moving on to Entangling Shot. Entangling Shot does 75% weapon damage and also will hit 2 enemies, so it does a very minor AoE effect, and it slows targets. The primary reason for using Entangling Shot is just to generate hatred and to slow targets and control them more so than damage. Chain Gang just makes it hit 4 targets, so that's still a very weak AoE, especially considering its low base damage. Shock Collar boosts its damage up to 101%, which is certainly better, but is still, to be honest, just terrible. Heavy Burden increases the slow, does not directly increase its damage. Justice is Served gives it better hatred generation, but even with that, there are better hatred generators. And then Bounty Hunter gives it some minor lifesteal. So all in all, Entangling Shot is a very poor choice for damage, and you should only be using it if you want to snare targets. But I can't recommend it for damage. Next up, Bolas Shot. Bolas Shot, you fire a bola, after a second they explode, you do 240% weapon damage, total 130% to the target initially, and then an additional 110% as fire to targets within a small radius, 7 yards. 7 yards is not very large, but it is something. Volatile Explosives extends that to 14 yards, which is actually substantial, and turns it into a solid AoE. One of your best AoE choices for the Hatred builders in terms of damage, but doesn't help it for single target damage. Thunderball does boost its damage very slightly. It just makes it do 130% when the bola explodes rather than 110, so you're gaining a whopping 20%, going from 240 to 260% total, and giving it a chance to stun, but not a vast improvement. Acid Strike could be very strong against single targets. It shoots 3 bolas, each doing 130%. That is 390% total, so that is quite solid, just spamming it. Unfortunately, you cannot hit one target with all 3 bolas. Even if you only have one target, only one bola will ever hit, and the other 2 will just miss. If you have more than one target, the other bolas automatically will just seek out other targets and hit them. So Bolas Shot, or rather Acid Strike Bolas Shot, is not a wise choice for single targets. It will actually do significantly less damage against single targets, just 130%, because they no longer explode. Bitter Pill is more just to give you more discipline, so that's not really relevant. And now finally, Imminent Doom. Imminent Doom does far more damage than the base ability, 336%, but it takes longer to detonate. It now takes 2 seconds rather than 1 second. So it's not as spammy, and it takes longer to affect opponents, at least for the explosion. So in terms of single target damage, Imminent Doom is your best bet. At least for burst damage, you're doing 336% damage after an explosion. However, in terms of just damage per second, base Bolas Shot is better. Base Bolas Shot does 240% weapon damage per second, whereas Imminent Doom does 336% every 2 seconds. So your damage per second is actually just 168%, which is quite a bit lower than the base Bolas Shot, unfortunately. But in terms of just doing as much damage in a single shot as you can, it would be Imminent Doom. Damage per second, though, is definitely base Bolas Shot, or any of its runes, for that matter. Any of its other runes, barring, say, Acid Strike. Okay, moving on to grenades. Unfortunately, grenades does very poor damage to single targets. 95% weapon damage is fire per grenade, but the grenades, if you don't know, they arc out, they scatter, and it's very difficult to actually hit one target with multiple grenades. If not, just impossible, barring huge bosses like Belial and Osmodon. So that's the base ability. 95% weapon damage is fire. Very poor compared to basically everything I've talked about. Tinkerer gives it better hatred generation. Firebomb now throws out a single grenade for 124%, which is an improvement over the base ability, for single targets. But it's still terrible. 124% weapon damage is still quite poor. Stun grenades is a utility. Gas grenades makes it leave a cloud of poison that does 25% weapon damage per second for 3 seconds. So you're talking a grand total of 95% plus 75%, so 170%, which is an improvement, but is still far worse than Bolas Shot or Hungering Arrow, though it is better than Entangling Shot if you can get a target to actually stand in the poison for a reasonable amount of time. Even just 1 second would give you 120% on the target, which does out DPS Entangling Shot. It's still a pretty poor choice, unfortunately. Really, your only option in terms of good damage runes for grenades is Cluster Grenades. Cluster Grenades, surprisingly, is actually quite good, and if you've used it, you may have noticed this. The tooltip does not tell the whole story. It's only 112%, but it's over an 8-yard radius, and the radius is so large that you can actually hit a single target with 1 grenade, or rather with 2 grenades. They can overlap. You can also spam it very quickly. And what the tooltip doesn't tell you is Cluster Grenades does 112%, but they tick 2 to 3 times every time you throw the grenade. Each individual grenade, so 3 grenades, so each of those cluster patches that I just showed you can tick 2 to 3 times. So its actual damage is more like 224%, or if it ticks 3 times, and it doesn't always tick 3 times, but 336%. That makes it by far your best choice for single target damage, barring Hungering Arrow, which is definitely a better choice if it pierces. If it doesn't pierce, you'll actually consistently be doing more damage with grenades, but once you start piercing and critting with Hungering Arrow, you can really ramp up damage very, very quickly, especially if you crit, because the amount of damage is so much higher per shot, whereas Cluster Grenades are smaller ticks. Hungering Arrow, the pierces are larger chunks of damage, so the percentages favor it for giving you very, very large crits. Moving on, all that is left is Evasive Fire. Evasive Fire is actually a pretty poor damage ability. It's more to just keep you safe than anything else, because you do a backflip. But it does generate more hatred than the other abilities. It generates 4, whereas Hungering Arrow is 3, Entangling Shot is 3, Bolas Shot is 3, and Grenades is 3. Base. Entangling Shot and Grenades can be runed to give you 6. And if you spec into Grenadier, along with Tinkerer, you can actually get 8 hatred per grenade. So you can theoretically generate hatred very, very, very quickly with the ability. But anyway, Evasive Fire gives you 4 hatred, and it costs 4 discipline whenever you backflip. Shrapnel gives it an extremely poor AoE, 30% to all enemies within 6 yards of the primary target. It doesn't help you against single targets, it only will hit secondary targets. The exploding bolts, they will not hit your primary target. Parting Gift leaves behind a grenade that does 45% weapon damage as poison in a 12-yard radius after a 1.2 second arming time, which is pretty terrible, I have to say. Evasive Fire lets it hit up to 3 additional targets for 125% weapon damage each, which does not help its single target damage. Displace just makes the backflip on par with Vault, and then Surge makes the backflip cost just 2 discipline, and it makes it do lightning damage. Evasive Fire is not a good choice for single target damage. I think I can really just leave it at that and move on. So now let's talk about AoEs. Hungering Arrow does 115% weapon damage and has a 35% chance to pierce through targets. So by that, its nature, if you have 2 targets, you can pierce 1 and hit 2 and do 115% times 2, 230. You hit 3 at another 115%, 345, and then so on and so on. So it does have AoE potential, but you're never going to be hitting many targets, which is the base ability. Puncturing Arrow gives it a greater chance to pierce, so that indirectly will increase its AoE damage. Cinder Arrow will give it some fire damage in addition to the base ability, but I feel like Puncturing Arrow, piercing more often, will definitely out-damage Cinder Arrow. Shatter Shot is the first really true AoE rune for this ability. It makes it so that every time you pierce, you get 3 arrows. So, as I mentioned before, Shatter Shot, your arrow, it pierces once, you get 3 arrows, no more, can't infinitely pierce, you can't get infinite arrows. So you're talking 3 arrows times 115%, plus the initial arrow, 460% weapon damage. That's certainly better than some choices like Entangling Shot, but all in all, it's a very weak AoE. You are limited to 3 additional targets just as a hard cap, and we have other options that are far better choices. I definitely feel like Shatter Shot will beat out Spray of Teeth. Spray of Teeth requires you to get a critical hit, which is not a big deal for a Demon Hunter. We crit more often than most classes, barring maybe Wizards, and we have Sharpshooter and Archery if we use hand crossbows, and the Scoundrel can help us crit more if we need to. So it's not a big deal to get a crit, but it's only a small radius when you do have the Spray of Teeth proc. I wouldn't say it's more than maybe 8 yards tops, maybe 10. It's pretty small, and it's just 50% weapon damage, which is nothing spectacular. I definitely feel like we have better choices in AoEs for just our Hatred builders. Certainly our Hatred spenders, but also our Hatred builders. So next up is Entangling Shot. It will hit up to 2 targets, so you're looking at 75% times 2, a grand total of 150% weapon damage. Chain Gang boosts it up to 4, so 75% times 4 would give you 300% weapon damage. That honestly is beaten out even by Hungering Arrow Shatter Shot. Shot Collar boosts it up to 101%, but it only hits 2 targets without Chain Gang, so you're looking at just 202% weapon damage, so it's actually inferior to Chain Gang for AoE. Heavy Burden is utility, Justice is Served is utility, and Bounty Hunter is utility. Entangling Shot is really more about utility than a damage ability. It's poor single target and poor AoE damage. Next up is Bolas Shot. So Bolas Shot, as we have said, is 240% total damage, but only 110% is spread over a 7-yard radius for AoE. So Bolas Shot with volatile explosives will give you 110% damage over 14 yards. You could easily hit 10 targets in that, so we'll say 110% times 10 gives you a grand total of 1,100% weapon damage to the secondary targets. Add that to the original 130% weapon damage to the primary target, and you have a grand total of 1,230% weapon damage in a 14-yard radius over 10 targets. So I would definitely say that that is superior to Hungering Arrow. I think that's going to be a lot more consistent than Hungering Arrow. It is quite easy to get 10 targets within a 14-yard radius, though Shatter Shot Hungering Arrow will do more damage still against single targets. So if you wanted to have kind of a hybrid, good against single targets, good against multiple targets, I think Shatter Shot Hungering Arrow would be a better bet. Thunderball just makes it do 130% weapon damage over a 14-yard radius, but that 20% is definitely not going to out-damage volatile explosives in the long run. Acid Strike, unfortunately, is very poor, not only against single targets, but also against groups of targets, because it shoots out 3 bolas. They do not explode, though, so no matter what, you're only ever going to do 390% weapon damage. That might beat Shatter Shot if you get really unlucky on pierces with Hungering Arrow, but it's definitely not going to beat out volatile explosives. Bitter Pill is utility to help regen Discipline. Imminent Doom boosts the explosion to 154%, but it's still only a 7-yard radius, so ultimately you are definitely going to be better off with even base Bolas Shot. Well, not base Bolas Shot, but volatile explosives. In terms of DPS, though, you would be better off with base Bolas Shot, because once again, Imminent Doom is over 2 seconds. So let's say with just base Bolas Shot, you hit 10 targets. You know what, we'll drop it down to 5. 7 yards is pretty small. Let's be more realistic. We'll say it's 5 targets. So 110% times 5 gives us 550. Imminent Doom is 154% times 5, which would give you 770. But in terms of DPS, you need to divide it by 2 because it's every 2 seconds. So divide it by 2, and you get 385. So in terms of DPS, even base Bolas Shot beats out Imminent Doom. For an AoE, I would recommend Volatile Explosives for Bolas Shot, definitely. I think it's a better choice than Shatter Shot Hungering Arrow if you're just looking for AoE. Next up is Grenades, and I've already talked about Grenades. The base ability is really poor. It's hard to really, even against crowds, it's hard to hit the targets you want and to hit an individual target with 2 grenades in a group of enemies. It's just, I don't think it's very good. Tinkerer is utility. I've already talked about Firebomb, either single target or an AoE. It's terrible. Stun grenades is utility, and gas grenades really isn't worthwhile for a crowd. as well, just because you have to force him to stand in the smoke into the poison clouds to really build up damage, and even then, for 3 seconds, 75%, nothing spectacular. Your best bet by far is cluster grenades. As I said before, cluster grenades ticks either 2 or 3 times, so we'll take an average. So if it ticks twice, that's 224% weapon damage. If it ticks 3 times, it's 336% weapon damage. We'll just add those together, divided by 2, and we get an average of 280% weapon damage. We'll multiply that times 5 for the 8-yard radius. That's the radius of 1 grenade, and we get a grand total of 1,400% weapon damage, which is definitely better than a volatile explosives Bolas Shot. And it's 8 yards per grenade. You're looking at 24 yards, essentially. It's 8 yards per grenade. I mean, you can see. Per grenade, this whole area. It's a very large radius. So, personally, I think cluster grenades is your best bet for AoE in terms of damage and DPS for the Hatred builders. So let us quickly look at Evasive Fire and dismiss it because it's a pretty poor single target or AoE ability. The base ability shoots one target for 125%. If we add in Shrapnel, it does 30% to all targets in a 6-yard radius. Well, 30% is really, really poor. 6 yards is pretty small. Even if you hit 5 targets in that 6-yard radius, you're just looking at 150% weapon damage. Add onto that the original shot, which will do 125% to your initial target, and you're looking at 275% weapon damage. Very, very poor. Parting Gift gives you 45% damage in a 12-yard radius, but 45% is still awful. And it does have a 1.2 second arming time, so they could actually move out of the way as well. 45%, let's say we hit 10 targets, is just 450% weapon damage, plus the original 125% against your initial target, and you're looking at 575%. That does have potential, but it's easily beaten out by Bolas Shot with explosives, volatile explosives, or very easily beaten out by cluster grenades in terms of just raw damage and DPS for both of those abilities. Covering Fire just replaces the initial ability. You no longer have the initial shot, and you just shoot out 3 in a fork in a trident pattern. So it's just 125% times 3. So you're looking at 375% weapon damage, pretty poor. Displace just brings the, as I've said, I think when I was talking about the single target ability, it brings it on par with Vault in terms of the backflip, and Surge just turns it into lightning damage, so definitely not a wise choice. Well guys, that's basically it. That is the damage potential of all the Hatred builders. So in conclusion, I think that your best bet for single target is either Devouring Arrow, Hungering Arrow, I think it has the most potential, or just spamming grenades with cluster grenades. Your best bet for AoE for the Hatred builders is definitely either cluster grenades or volatile explosives Bolas Shot, though I do think that cluster grenades is going to do more damage. I will go on in the next episode to talk about the Hatred spenders. I can tell you the next episode is probably going to be a pretty long one, and I will talk about the discipline abilities and how they can affect that, and eventually I will talk about passives, and I'll probably finish off with gear, though gear will take me 2 minutes to talk about. It's very, very simple for this class. Alright guys, thanks for watching. Stay tuned for more. If you thought this was educational, please give it a like. Please ask questions, leave comments, critique my methodology, but if you do so, please actually support what you're saying with math or just common sense or something. Don't just say, you is wrong, because that doesn't help anybody. It doesn't help me. It doesn't help the people reading the comments, and the whole point of this is to be educational and to just help people figure out their Demon Hunter a bit better and optimize him. Please sub if you want to see more Diablo 3 stuff, and have a good one, guys.